in this session, we'll understand data structure of an SAP system. Before you start writing your ABAP programs, you need to understand how the data is stored in the SAP system. As I said previously, with ABAP programs, we'll be mostly dealing with data. So you need to understand few terms that we use in terms of data. I'll be explaining you about these terms. There's something called client, so we'll see what is client. And when you're saving any data, the data could be client specific data or it could be cross client data. So we'll try to understand what's the difference between cross client specific customizing and cross client customizing. And then there's something called repository. It basically means all the database where you're storing the data. And then there is a term called packages, which you need to understand. So we'll be understanding these few terms in this session so that you're more comfortable when I'm using these terms in the class. So what is client? When you're logging into an SAP system, on the login screen, you have to input three things. For example, here is the login screen of an SAP system. On this screen, you can see three things. One is client, in fact, four things: client, user, password, and logon language. SAP supports multiple logon languages, so you can choose which language you want to log into the SAP system. So once you log into a specific language, then all the menus, everything that you see on the screen will be in that particular language. So right now, if I log into English, then I see everything in English, all the menu, text, and everything. So similarly, you enter your username, password, and you also need to choose which client you want to log into, right? So this is your client field. A client is a 3-digit number. So when you set up your SAP system, within that system, you can create multiple clients, okay? One purpose of using these clients is, for example, let's say I have a development system and I have created one client called 100 in that system. Then I can also create another client, let's say 200, to use it for a different purpose. Client basically segregates the data. So when I log into the SAP system in client 100 and generate or create some data, then that data resides within that client. So I can access that data only when I log into that particular client. So whatever data you're generating in client 100, you can access that data only when you're logged into client 100. If I log into a different client, let's say client 200, then I can only access the data that is generated or available within that client. So client is basically used to separate the data. Okay, so this is where we use the terms client specific data and cross client customizing. Client specific data means or client specific customization means if you're trying to do some customization, and if that customization or if that data is visible or is accessible only from that particular client in which you have generated that data, then we call it client specific customizing. So in other terms, if you're doing some customization, client specific customization, then that will only affect the current client in which you are logged into. It will not impact other clients in the system. Okay, but if you're doing a cross client customization, then you do it in one client and it will automatically reflect in all the clients of the system. Okay, even the data, for example, you try to create a sales order in the system and you're logged into client 100, then this sales order will be created or will be available only in client 100. If I log into 200 and try to access that sales order which was created in client 100, I won't be able to access it because this is restricted to the client. So if I want to access the same sales order in another client, then I have to again create it in another client. Okay, so generally the transaction data like your sales orders, purchase orders, materials, all this data will be client specific. So you create the data in one client, it will be in that client only. Okay, so all the customizing, for example, you set a public holiday calendar, then that can be cross client, so that you set it once in the system and by default it will be available for all the clients in the system. You don't have to repeat it in all the clients. So like that, whenever you are updating the data in a database, it could be client specific or cross client. What exactly differentiates like for example, let's say I'm trying to save some data in particular database table, then what exactly makes that data client specific or cross client? Okay. Let's say I want to, you join my organization and I want to create a SAP ID for you. I want to create a new user ID for you. For that, I'll use one application called SU01. Okay, I'll go to this application. I'll click on this create button to create a new account. Let's say some account. I'll click on create. And here I'll input all your information, your name, your password, for example. Here I can set a password for you. Then I can assign certain roles for you, what kind of roles you can perform using this system. I can also set something called profiles. So this is like authorization profile. So this will decide what transactions can you access and what you cannot access. Right? So like that, I'll input all this information and finally I'll click on save. Once I click on save, this application will update the data in the database in some certain specific tables, right? So let's see what are the tables it is updating the data in. I'll just set some dummy password. When I click on save, it says the user is created, but where is it created? Let me take this username. We'll be seeing all these tools that we use to access the tables, to see the data in a particular table. I'll be discussing this later. So for example, there's a table called USR01. There are quite a few user tables. Some data gets updated in one table, some other data about the user gets updated in a different table. So if you see this table, here you can see that user which I created using that application, it has basically updated that information about the user in this particular table, USR01, right? Now, is it client specific or cross client? That means I've created this user while I was logged into client 001 in this system. And let's say there is one more client in this system called client 100. So can I access this data about the user while I log into client 100 and open this table? Or in other terms, I've created this user ID in client 001. So the user can log into 001 client using this information. Can he also log into other client? Because if he has to log into other client, then his user details should exist in that client also. That means his user account should have been created in that client also, because the system is trying to read the data from a table to validate whether the user exists or not, right? If you look at this table, whenever you are using any SAP application to create data, and that application will update data in a particular table, and if that table has something called MANDT as the first field, which is a client field, that means the data will be restricted to that client. Okay, the system will automatically fill this field with the current client you're logged into, so that whenever I'm trying to read the data, it will only pull the data relevant to that client. Okay, so in simple terms, technically, whenever you are saving some data in a database table, and if that table has this first field, MANDT, as the client field, then all the data that you store in that table will become client specific data. That means you can only access that data from the client in which the data was created. If you try to open this table or access data from this table from a different client, you won't be able to access that data often, because it always restricts the data to the current client. Okay, so whenever I'm querying this table also, the system will automatically try to fetch me the data from the current client. In programming, while writing the code, we can also write the code in such a way that I can access data from different clients also. But generally, we don't do that. But it is possible to do that. So, but generally, in simple terms, Whenever you are updating data in a database table, when the user is performed certain activity and you're updating that data in a database table, and if that table is restricted with this MANDT field as the first field, then that becomes client specific data, right? So when I created a user ID, it was getting updated in this particular table, and this table has MANDT field. So that means the user data is client specific. If I want this user to access another client in my system or log into another client in the system, then I have to create his user account in that client. Only then he'll be able to access that client, okay, or log into that client. So this is your client specific data. Client is only to segregate the data. For example, let's say you have one development system and you want to use that system also for training, end user training. And for end users, you want to generate some data which may affect the development data. So as a developer, you are creating some test data, but for end users, you want to create different set of data. Then if you use the same client, then you are creating some data and the other person is overwriting that data because he wants to show it to the end users. Then it creates problems. So in that case, what we can do is we can create a separate client for training so that the developers can log into one client and they'll have access to their data, and the training coordinator can log into a different client where he can set up his own data to demonstrate it to his users. So like that we can separate the data. So like that, it's a 3-digit number client. So you can have from 000 to 999. So you can practically have up to 1,000 clients in the system. But generally we don't use that many clients, and we only use few clients. In fact, companies don't even prefer using clients. They prefer using a separate system itself. So instead of having multiple clients in the same system, they'll prefer having a separate system. So they'll have one system for let's say development, one system for training, one system for quality, one system for production. So we actually separate the systems itself. I'll talk about it in a while. We'll understand why we have to separate the systems and not rely on the client for segregating the data. So this is the client specific data. Now, as I said, if the table has MANDT as the field, then the data becomes specific to the client. Now, what is cross client? Let me do one more thing. So let's say I want to set up some public holiday list in the system. So I'll go to this SPRO transaction, which is the transaction which the functional consultants generally use to customize the system. So here, if I go to NetWeaver, general settings, maintain calendar, and let's say I want to create a new public holiday record in the system. And when I'm creating this, when I click on create, it's showing me some screen. Whatever data I update in this screen will be updated in one specific table, because as I said, anything that you want to store persistently in the SAP system should be updated in the database. So in the database, we have different tables for storing different data. So this application will update data in a specific table. So in SAP, the good thing is everything is well documented. For example, if you want to see which table a particular transaction is updating, then you can just keep your cursor in a field, press F1. It will show the documentation or F1 help about that field. And if you click on this button called technical information, then it will show you a pop-up where it will show some technical information. And one of them is the table name in which the data will be updated. So if you go to this table, and SAP, another good thing is that it supports forward navigation. So you can just double click and it will take you to that particular object. So if I double click on this table name, it will automatically open this table for me to see. So if I double click, it has navigated to this ABAP dictionary tool and opened the table. So, and if you notice in this table, there is no MANDT field, right? That means whenever you update some data in this table, it is not restricted by a client. It is by default available in all the clients, because we are not restricting the data using that MANDT client field, right? So now if I set a public holiday, a new public holiday in the system, then I don't need to do it in all the clients. I do it in one client and it automatically becomes available in all the clients in the system, because this is a cross client table. because in this table the data is not restricted by a client and there is no MANDT field. So if you are confused whether if you are doing some customization and you're confused whether it will affect only this client or all the clients in the system, you can quickly look at the table in which the data is getting updated and see if the data is restricted by that MANDT field. If it is restricted, then whatever you're trying to do will be affected only in the current client. If it is not restricted, then whatever customizing you're trying to do will affect other clients in the system as well. So you need to be more careful about what you're doing. Okay, so that is cross-client customization. So in simple terms, client-specific data means the data is available only in the current client in which you are logged into. Cross-client data means the data is you create in one client, but the data can be accessed from any client in the system. Okay, and the client concept is simply to segregate the data so that you can use it for different purpose. Okay. However, when you are setting up your SAP system, what we generally do is you have one option where you have your SAP system and you can have multiple clients in that system and you can use it for different purpose. For example, let's say the user is trying to use one SAP application to create a sales order. Now he's using it in the business sense. He's actually creating some real data, real sales order. But while using that application, he is facing some challenges. There is some error or is not able to save certain data. So he'll ask for help. He'll say that, okay, this application is not working, please fix it. Now to fix it, we need to make some changes to the program. Now you make a change, and if you don't test the change thoroughly, then you're trying to change or fix a certain issue, but it can introduce a new issue, right? And you cannot take that risk in a production environment. So generally what we do is that we'll have three environments. One is the development environment, one is a quality environment, and the third is a production environment. Now, using these clients, you can use all these three environments in the same system by having separate clients for each environment. So let's say you can have one client for development environment, one client for quality environment, one client for production environment. But that will only help when it comes to client-specific data. But as we've seen, there is also something which you can do, which is cross-client. So if you have all these three environments in the same system, separated by different clients, then you won't be able to test any cross-client customizations before it can be used in production. Because the moment you change something in the development environment, it will automatically reflect in the production environment also before testing it, right? So there's a risk. So what generally companies do is that they don't use the same system with different clients. Instead, they prefer having separate systems. Okay. So instead of having these three clients, or let's say dev, quality, and production, instead of having these three clients in the same system, what companies prefer doing is that they'll have three separate systems. So you have your development system. If you wish, you can have different clients in this system to do different things. So you have a separate system. When I say separate system, it has its own application server, it has its own database. Okay. Then you have your separate quality system, and you have your separate production system. Okay. Generally, as a developer, we get access to the development system and the quality system. We don't generally get access to the production system unless you are in a really big position as a developer, a senior developer, a team leader, or somebody who needs, because this production has real business data, so they don't really give access to that data, that system, to anybody. But the functional consultants generally have access to the to all these three systems, because they need to check the applications in the production environment if the user is patient. So for functional consultants, they get access to the production, but for developers, we don't get access to the production system. because as a developer we can write or execute some code which can really damage the system. And also the data is sensitive, so company won't be comfortable showing their real business data to everybody. So what we do is you develop your applications in the development system, and once the development is complete, you will transport that to a quality system where the application can be tested to make sure everything is working as expected. In the quality system, generally the functional consultant will test it first because he's the one who has given you the requirement. And once he's satisfied, he'll ask the business users to test it because they are the original users, so they should be satisfied too. And once everybody is satisfied, then we'll move this to production. Okay, so there's a chain basically. The project manager, whoever is responsible for the project, he has to approve. So he'll ensure that the application, everything is tested thoroughly before it can be moved to production. So you cannot just move anything to production. The manager should approve the transport. Only then it can be moved to production. So this is the general process. Now one question may come, you have a development system separately where you have developed the application. Why can't you just test it in the development system itself? And if everything looks good, directly move to production. Why do we need to have a quality system? Okay. The answer to that is, in development system, you won't have the real-time test data to test your application. For example, if I'm developing one application for Walmart as a customer, and then I need to use some real data to test it. So I need to set up the Walmart customer in my development system, and then I have to test that with that data. Generally, in development system, we don't do all that. We don't set up all the data in the development system. So we use purely for development. So if you want to test it, you can only perform unit testing, but nothing more than that. Actual business testing or integration testings, we cannot do all that in the development system because we don't have the required data for that. So what companies do is they'll refresh their quality system with the production data every 1 month or every 6 months, so that your quality system is an exact replica of your production system. So if something exists in the production system, it should exist in the quality system because it's the same image. So you take an image of the production system and restore it in your quality system. So your quality system becomes a duplicate copy of your production system. So when you're testing the application in the quality system, you have the real-time data to test the application, even though it can be a bit old, but you still have all the data. You have the same configurations as in the production system. So if something works in quality system, it should definitely work in the production system. Okay, so that's why we keep a separate quality system for testing, which can be refreshed, because you cannot refresh your development system with the production data, where there could be people developing different, there could be multiple projects going on, somebody is developing something, and if you refresh it, all your new developments that you're doing, which doesn't yet exist in the production system, will be lost. Right? So that's why we cannot refresh our development system. That's why we keep a separate system which can be refreshed with the production data, and since it's an exact replica of the production system, when you're testing in the quality system, you can be more assured that if something works in quality, it should definitely work in production because it's a clone of the production system. So this is how we do. Instead of having one system and having different clients, we generally prefer having separate systems itself. So even though this client concept exists and you should be aware of it, but we generally don't really bother about it because we typically have only one client in the system most of the times. We rarely have multiple clients in the system. Okay, but you are free if you want to have a scenario where you want to set up a new client, you can do that. That is a possibility. So that is about client specific data and cross client data. I hope that concept is clear. So you understand what is client, you understand client specific data, you understand cross client customization. So here you can see, let's say we have client 100, client 200. Client 100 has its own data, its own application data. As I said, all the orders that you create, like sales orders, invoices, everything is client specific. Generally, those tables have the same entity field. So the data gets restricted to the current client. And then the user data is also client specific. So you create a user in one client, it only exists in that client. And then any client specific customer. So all this data is specific to the client. And you can also have cross-client customizing, like I've shown you, the public holiday calendar. you set it up in one client and by default it is available in all the clients. And then we have something called repository objects. So what are these repository objects? Whatever developments that you do as an ABAP consultant, for example, you create a report program, or you create a form, or you create a function module, right? Or you create a transaction. So all this, or you create a table, all these things are repository objects. And these repository objects are by default cross-client. And how do you know when you're creating something, how do you know whether that is a repository object or not? Okay. One way to know is all the repository objects are grouped into packages. So for example, if I try to create a new program using this ABAP editor, which I'll be in the next session, I'll be giving you introduction to the various tools we use in ABAP. So I'll be talking about this ABAP editor at that time. So when I'm creating this program, once I click on save, you'll notice that system is prompting me to enter something called a package. Okay. So if you are getting this prompt, that means you are creating a repository object, and these repository objects are cross-client. So if you have client 100, client 200 in this system, and if I'm creating this program in client 100, then I don't need to create this program again in client 200 because it's a repository object and it is cross-client. So the moment you create in one client, it will automatically be available in another client. So the moment you change the code in one client, that code will automatically be changing in another client. In fact, it's the same thing when you are creating this program information and the code is getting updated in a particular table in the database, and that table does not have a main DT as the field, so the data is not restricted by client. So basically you change something in one client, it automatically reflects in another client, right? So that's why we don't use clients for to use it as quality of production environments, because it doesn't allow you to test your changes. The moment you change the program in dev client, and if you have another production client, then it will automatically reflect in the production client. So you don't have an opportunity to test those changes. So whenever you are creating something, and if the system is prompting you to input a package name, then you are creating a repository object. Now what is this package? Package is simply a way to organize your developments. For example, if you are creating one object for sales and distribution module, then all the objects that you are developing for sales and distribution module, you can group them into one package. So that tomorrow if you want to see all the developments that are part of sales and distribution, you can just search by the package. It is only to group. It doesn't really influence how your program runs or anything like that. It is only to organize your developments. So for example, let's say I want to find out all the user exits that SAP has provided for a particular module. Okay. Then SAP also organizes them in packages. So it will be very easy for me to search for them. So for example, here I can select package as the option and give the package name. So I'm not sure if this package exists in this trial system. Let me see. No, it doesn't exist. So if you are using a regular SAP system or an IDES system, you can search for this vmod package and it will list all the enhancements that are available in that package. So similarly, you can search for any package. So for example, there is one demo package provided and it can display all the applications. So it will, like if you're creating any table or a transaction or a program or function module, and if you're keeping all of them in the same package, then you can, at one place you can see all the related development objects belonging to that package, right? So it's only to organize your developments. It doesn't really influence how the program behaves or anything like that technically. But again, there are two things you need to be aware of when it comes to packages. There's something called a transportable package and there's another thing called non-transportable package. So when you're creating a development object, and if you are creating it in development system but you want to move it to a quality or a production system later, then you have to keep that in a transportable package. Only then you'll be able to transport it. So at the package level, they'll maintain the details as which system it should be transported to. But if you're creating some test program, for example, let's say in your development system, you're just simply creating one test program and you have no intention to transport it, then you can keep it under the non-transportable object. So I'll be talking about these packages in the next session before we create our first program. So we'll see how you create a package and how you can make it a transportable package, and how what makes it a non-transportable package. So at that time you'll have a better idea. But whenever you're creating any object, and if the object is prompting you to enter a package, that means you're creating a repository object. So all the development objects that we create are called repository objects. And the important thing you should be aware of about repository objects is that they are cross-client. So except for SAP scripts, everything else that you develop in ABAP is cross-client. So if you have multiple clients in your development system, then you develop once in one client and it will automatically be available in other clients of the system. You don't need to transport it between clients. Otherwise, there's some transportation mechanism available to transfer data between clients also. So if you have set up some data in one client and you want the same data in another client, you can transport it to another client. So there are certain tools available for that. But whereas for repository objects, you don't need to do that because they are by default available in all the clients. So these are the things you should be aware of. So hope you have understood these terms, because I'll be using these terms throughout the course. So whenever I'm using these terms, you should be aware of what exactly I'm trying to tell you. So we have achieved the purpose of this session if you can easily understand or identify these terms. You understand what is client, you understand client-specific data, you understand what is cross-client customization, you understand repository objects, and you understand packages. Okay? So that's all I have for this session. And in the next video, we'll be we'll log into the SAP system. We actually try to understand the SAP GUI screen. What are the different elements? And then I'll give you an introduction to ABAP.